So then, now we've created this web application and we're running it just locally on our computer at localhost at the minute. But ideally, you'd probably like to deploy this to the web at some point so that other people around the world can access this website as well. Unless, of course, you're like me and you just enjoy creating Vue apps to run on your computer. Probably not. So in this chapter, I'm going to show you how to deploy this to Firebase hosting. Now, there's a few steps involved in this. So first of all, go to your project on the back end and then go down to hosting. And then in here, I want you to click on Get Started. And this provides all the different steps we need to take. So first of all, we need to install something called Firebase Tools globally on our computer. And that is the thing that we're going to use to then deploy applications to Firebase hosting. So we need this installed on our computer. So let's copy this, and I'm going to open up my terminal and I'm going to paste it in. And notice this is globally installed on our computer. We don't install it for each project that we make, just once on our computer. Then we can use Firebase Tools to deploy any application in the future. So press enter to install that. And then while that's installing, I'm going to show you the next step. So if we click on next, it says initialize your project. But first of all, we have to sign in to Google. So on our computer, we need to authenticate ourselves so that when we come to deploy, we have the credentials to do that. It doesn't just let anyone deploy to our backend because that would leave it open to abuse, right? So we have to log in on our computer first of all. So copy this and then come over here and paste it in. Now, I've already logged in on my computer in the past, so nothing's going to happen for me here. But when you press enter, it should open up a little window asking you to log in to your Google account. So do that, and then you're authenticated on your computer. Like I said, not much is going to happen for me on my computer because I'm already logged in. Okay, so now I'm going to initialize a new Firebase project. So copy this, and then come to your project directory and then paste this in. So Firebase init. And what this does is initialize a Firebase project on the front end for us in this directory. Now you might be thinking, hang on, we've already created all of this Firebase config right here. Wasn't that initializing the project? Well, no, not really. This was just using the Firebase JavaScript SDK to connect to the backend. But now what we're doing is initializing a Firebase project to deploy to the web. So there is a difference. So we need to do this step in order to deploy it. So it's going to ask us right here, are you ready to proceed? Press yes and enter. And it's going to ask us which services we want to use. Now, although we have used the Firestore, I'm not going to select it here because we've already set up and created our Firestore on the back end. So I don't want to configure it anymore from the front end. There's no need. But in the next project, when we perform all of this from the very start, then we will do it. But for now, don't check this. So now move down and select hosting with spacebar and then press enter. And it's asking us here to connect to a current project or create a new one. Now, I want to use an existing project because I already have one created on the back end. So I'm going to select this and it's going to ask us which project to connect to. So I'm going to scroll down to this one right here, which is what I'm using, Udemy Vue Firebase Sites. Press enter. And right here, it's asking us, what do we want to use as our public directory? Now, this is the directory that gets deployed to Firebase. The default one is called public, but I'm going to call this instead dist because when we create a Vue application, Vue builds it into a dist folder, and that's the stuff we want to deploy. So I want Firebase to take that dist folder and deploy that. So make sure you call this dist. And this next bit is important. It says configure as a single page app. So rewrite all URLs to /index.html. We need to say yes for this because remember, we're creating a single page application, and no matter what route or URL the user goes to, whether it's /chatroom or /welcome or /something else, at the end of the day, we always send back the same index.html file, and then it's Vue that takes over this and injects the content relevant for that route. But it's always the same HTML file. So this is saying, do you want to always send back the same HTML file, index.html, regardless of the route? And yes, we do. So make sure you select yes for this and press enter. And then we don't want to link this with GitHub, so press no. And then we want to say yes if you get that option. You shouldn't get that option because it's the first time you're doing this. I did a test run first of all, but if you do get that, press yes. And then Firebase initialization is now complete. So you might notice a few things. First of all, over here, a dist folder with an index.html file inside it. That's the folder created by Firebase, which is ultimately going to be deployed. Now, when we create or when we build our Vue application, it's going to put all the built files inside here, including the HTML file, which will override this one right here. And ultimately, that's the thing that will be deployed to Firebase hosting. Now, the other things are this thing right here, Firebase RC, and this just says what project to connect to on the back end. And this one down here, firebase.json, is some settings and rewrites for our hosting. So you don't have to worry too much about those for now. This is now initialized on the front end, and we can go to next over here and we can see this is the next step. But before we do that, we have to build our Vue application so that it's ready to deploy inside this dist folder, and we'll do that next. So then we've initialized a Firebase project on the front end and we have this dist folder ready to deploy. But before we deploy it, we need to build our Vue project, because at the minute it's all these separate Vue files and different JavaScript files inside these different folders. But we need to put all of our bundled JavaScript code and the HTML file inside this dist folder so that we can then deploy this, because we don't deploy all of these files. The server won't understand what these Vue files are and won't know what to do with them. So we need to bundle all of this together inside a JavaScript bundle and place it inside the dist folder. Now, this is really easy to do using Vue. All we need to do is come down here and run a single command, and that command is npm run, and then instead of serve, to serve it locally, build, and press enter, and this will build our Vue application for us. And once that's done, if you take a look inside the dist folder, now you can see we have a few different things. This is the index file, and right here we have some JavaScript bundles and then any CSS we have as well. So now this folder is ready to be deployed, and we'll do that next. So then we have initialized a Firebase project on the front end. We've also built our Vue application now, and this dist folder is ready for deployment. And all we have to do that is come down here and say Firebase deploy, and make sure you're in the correct project directory, then press enter. And Firebase is going to look at this dist folder and deploy it to the web. And then once it's done, we can come over to the Firebase backend, and if you refresh, then you should see your new deployed version right here. This one right here. So you can see it was me that deployed it right here. That's who deployed it. And we can view our app by clicking on one of these links right here. I'm going to click on this one to view it in a browser, and we can see this is the same site, and now it's on the internet. Let's just make sure this all works. I'm going to log in as mario@google.com and then test 1 2 3 4, log in, and now we can see that we're viewing the chat app, and all the chats are the same because it's still connecting to our same Firebase backend, and this all works. That's how simple it is to deploy a website to Firebase. Now, if you do have a custom domain, you can connect that right here and go through the different steps. The steps might vary slightly dependent on your domain provider, but it is relatively simple to do. Just click on this button and it will give you all the guidance that you need. Okay, so we've deployed this application and it's all working, but what if in the future you want to make updates to your website and then redeploy it? Well, relatively simple to do. Let's go back to our project and open the source folder. I'm going to make a very, very simple change. So all I'm going to do is go into the views and then go into the welcome screen, and I'm going to say log into the chat room here and then sign up to the chat room. Okay, that should be one word in each case. So chat room and chat room. And I'm going to save it. Now remember, we have to rebuild this because it's not changed in the dist folder, only in our source file. So we need to rebuild that so that this folder updates as well. So to do that, remember, we say npm run build and press enter. And then once that's done and all this is updated inside here, we can deploy again. And all we have to do is say Firebase deploy again and press enter. And again, that's going to take our dist folder and deploy it to the Firebase backend. Now, once it's done, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to hard refresh just to see if we can see that new version registered down here. And we can see this is the current one, which is 4 minutes later than the first one. Okay, so this is the current one that's showing. So it's automatically overridden the older one, but that's still there in the history. So if I go back to the project now, I'm going to, in fact, cross that off and I'll open this up again and I'm going to log out. And this might take a couple of minutes to update because at the minute you can see the title hasn't updated. And that's sometimes because Firebase just takes a minute or two to update the live version. So I'm going to just refresh to see if this has worked. And now we can see log in to the chat room. If we click on sign up to the chat room. So that's how simple it is. We just need to make our changes, rebuild the application, and then redeploy using Firebase deploy. Now, what if you want to roll back to an older version? Well, you can do. If you hover over this, you can see these 3 dots, click on that and click on rollback. And what that does is make the rolled back version right here the current one. So this is the original. This is the one we recently deployed, but now this one we've rolled back to, and this is the one that will show if we go to the website again. Now, again, it might just take a minute or two to update. I'm going to refresh over here. I'm going to close this and then I'm going to open this again and come over here. It's still not updated, so I'm just going to wait for a couple of minutes now before I refresh. All right, so let me try that again. Refresh. And now we can see it's rolled back to the old version. Now, so far we've created, built and deployed our Vue application to Firebase hosting, which is great, but there's still 2 problems here. The first one is that our Firestore database data is not really protected from unauthenticated users. Yes, we have to log in right here to see the chat room and ultimately send messages inside it, but anyone with some knowledge of Chrome DevTools can find our API key. So let me show you that. We can go to sources and then choose this JavaScript file and just type in API right here and press enter to search for it. And we can see the API key right here. Okay, so this is not really secure because then anyone can access this API key, and with that they can make requests to add some data to our database or read data from our database without being authenticated. So that's the first one. Our data is not protected properly and it's all fully readable and writable to anyone, authenticated or not. The second problem is that, again, anyone can access this API key right here and then use it in their own websites to interact with our Firebase backend. All they need to do is steal this API key and then set up a Firebase config like we have in our website over here. If we go to Firebase and config like this, and then they can use that to interact with our Firebase project. So they could access the database, authentication services, storage, hosting, etc. So this really compromises our application. Now, we'll look at how to address both of these issues in this section, starting with Firestore security rules. Now, this will help us combat the first problem, anyone being able to read and write data to the Firestore database, authenticated or not. We can write and deploy specific rules to Firebase Firestore which tell it who can access our data inside the database. For example, we can instruct it only to allow authenticated users to be able to read and write data to a specific collection. Now, these rules are the backbone of data security in Firebase apps, so we'll learn all about those first to secure our data next. So the first thing we'll do is update our Firestore rules to make our data a bit more secure. Now, you can update the Firestore rules either from your text editor or on the back end over here. And to do it on the back end, you go to Cloud Firestore. And then when this appears, you go to Rules and you can edit your rules in the editor right here. Now, the other way is to do it inside the text editor, inside a file in the root of the directory. So I'll make this new file and it's called Firestore.rules. So press enter and we make them inside here. Now, I would advise that we do make them inside here because that way whenever we deploy our website, we're deploying these Firestore rules as well, and we don't have to worry about these ones always being overridden. If we make changes here and then deploy our application, whatever is inside this file will override these rules. So it's always a good idea to make them locally and then deploy them when you need to. So the first thing I'm going to do is copy all of the rules we currently have and paste them in here to begin with. And by the way, if you don't see all of this syntax highlighting and coloring of the text, if yours looks all white, then try installing a package called Firebase. So just search for it at the top up here. And if you install this, it's going to color all of our text like this, and then it's easier to create and read. And this works for Firestore rules files. So definitely do that. So the first thing we see inside this rules file is the rules version. This is because there are currently 2 versions of the rules, so make sure yours is version 2. Then we declare the service that we're creating rules for, in our case, the Cloud Firestore, because we can also create rules for other services like storage. And then after that, we have a match statement right here. So this is how we create rules for different paths in our database by matching requests to paths. This first match statement right here is always present in your rules and basically matches any request into your database. Now, the curly braces right here represent a wildcard, which means it's a changeable value. And it basically means that this can be any database name. So this is the base path right here into your database, and it will match all requests to it. So we don't need to change that at all. Now, inside that first initial match statement is where we create additional paths and match statements for specific rules. The default match statement right here is saying match any document in our database and allow read and write access if the request time is before a specific date. Now, I'm going to remove this if condition for now, and we'll talk more about conditions later on. So get rid of all of this and this if statement and that colon, but keep the semicolon right here. Now, the document in curly braces right here and the 2 asterisks, that is another type of wildcard, and it means match a path to any documents in any collection or sub-collection from this point onwards. So now basically we're saying offer read and write access to any document inside any collection in our database. Now, this is not ideal because then anyone has read and write access to our database. Now, sometimes instead of using a wildcard like this to match every single document in every single collection of our database, we want to be a bit more specific. So I could say, for example, /messages, then /document is equal to double asterisks inside curly braces. And now this is only matching requests to any document inside the messages collection or any sub-collection of messages. So now we could access any of those documents, but inside a different collection, this would not match. So we're not creating a read and write rule for anything else other than documents inside the messages collection. And again, that's any document inside the messages collection or any sub-collection of the messages collection. Okay? So then, we can also use a different kind of wildcard. So instead of writing this, I could instead say message ID like so. And now this is a wildcard that still matches any document inside the messages collection, but not any sub collection of messages. So this does the same thing, but also it captures the ID of the document we're trying to get, if you like. So if we're trying to access a specific document, we can then capture the ID of that document and use it inside our rules. Now we'll see more of that later on, so don't worry too much about it, but just know that we can capture the ID of the document when we use a wildcard like this. Now it doesn't have to be called this, it can be called doc ID if you prefer, whatever makes sense to you. I'm going to call it message ID because we're in the messages collection, just as long as you don't have the document is equal to double asterisks, because that doesn't capture the ID and it's matching any sub-collection in the collection as well, whereas this one doesn't, and it captures the ID of the document. So again, this might not make much sense now, but we'll see more about that in our next big project. For now, what I'm going to do is only allow read access. So I'm going to remove write and just have read. And what that means is, yes, people can read our messages, read things from this collection, but no one is allowed to write new messages. So for instance, if we were trying to create a new chat, if I just log in first of all, mario@google.com, and then test1234, enter. If I try to add a new chat and hit send, that would be writing to the collection, but these rules won't allow that now. They're only allowing read access. So we could get all of the data and show it here, but we couldn't add more data. So let's try that. I'm going to save it, and I'm going to come down here and I'm going to deploy this. Now, I don't need to redeploy the whole application, only the Firestore rules. So to do that, I can say Firebase deploy like we did before, but this time -- only, and then whatever we want to deploy. In our case, Firestore : rules, and that will only deploy these Firestore rules now and not the website itself. Now, if you get this error like I have done, then you just need to go to your firebase.json file and scroll up, and at the top add in a new property, and this property is going to be Firestore like this. So we add the property, and that's an object, and right here we're specifying the rules file, Firestore rules, and you can add this indexes in if you wish. We don't necessarily need that just now, but add it in anyway. Okay, now when we're creating a new project in the future and we initialize Firebase from the very start, it will automatically generate all of this stuff for us. I'm showing you the manual way of doing it right now, but it will be a little bit easier later on. So you don't always have to do this when we're creating a new Firebase project from the start, but for now, just do this and then it should work. So come down here and then try deploying again. And this time it looks as though it's worked. So let's go back over here and I'm going to refresh on the rules to see if that's updated. And now we can see it's only read access to anything inside the messages collection. So if I try to go to my project and refresh, I'm going to now try sending a message, and now you can see could not send the message, and that's because we're not allowing the user write access. Now you could do the same. If you wish to only allow write access, this could be write and then you couldn't read them. You need to spell this correctly, of course, but you get the point. I'm not going to deploy this now, but hopefully you get the idea. And now we understand the basics of how a rule is structured using paths and wildcards. Let's try locking down our data to only authenticated users. So another thing we can do with these Firestore rules is add conditions. So only allow these things if a certain condition is true. And we do this by adding a colon at the end, and then if, and then some kind of statement on the right of this if. Now, if that statement evaluates to true, then we allow these things. If it's false, then we don't allow these. So for example, if I said if false, this will always be false. It's hard-coded, and so therefore we never allow read or write access. If this was true, then it would always be true. It's hard-coded, and we always allow read and write. Now, we don't ideally want to hard-code a value. There'd be no point in that. Instead, we want this to be some kind of dynamic value which will evaluate to either true or false. In our case, I'd like this to be whether a user is logged in or not logged in, because if they're logged in, if they're authenticated, I want to allow read and write access, because we need to read the data and write the data when we type in a new message and send. Now then, if they're not logged in, I don't want them to be able to read or write data, because if they somehow get past the route guard in our Vue application and still see this screen, I don't want Firebase to allow them to read the data or write new data if they're not authenticated. So we can use the request object that we get access to in Firestore rules. And this request object contains information about the request, and on that is the authentication status. Now, if a user is logged in when we're trying to read data or add new data, then this right here is not going to evaluate to null. If they're not logged in, it will evaluate to null. So I could say, allow read and write if request.auth is not equal to null. Because if they're not equal to null, it means they're logged in. If it is equal to null, it means they're logged out, and then we don't allow read and write access. Does that make sense? So now, if we deploy these by saying Firebase deploy only Firestore : rules, just to deploy the rules, then it means in the future, only people logged in will be able to have read and write access. Alright then, so we've solved the problem of locking down our data now, and we've increased the security of the data a little bit, but we still have the problem that a user might be able to open up the dev tools, go into the sources and find the API key inside the JavaScript. And if they find that, they can use that in their own projects to interact with our backend and use our services for our projects. So they can access the database, the authentication service, etc. Now, I don't want to allow people to be able to do that because that compromises our application. So I want to lock down our API key to only one domain. That would be our domain once we've deployed it. Now, to do that, you need to go to the developer console. So that's console.developers.google.com. And you need to select then your project up here that you're working on. This will be your Firebase project. Mine is called Udemy Vue Firebase Sites. Once you've done that, go to credentials and then look for this one, browser key. This is the API key created by Firebase. So if we click on that, we can see at the minute there's no restrictions. But if you click on HTTP referrers and then add an item down here, you can enter in your domain, and then only requests coming from that domain will be allowed when it reaches the Firebase backend. So then if another developer tries to use your API key and that request comes from their website, from their domain, when it reaches our backend, it will be refused. So they can no longer do that. Now, I'm not going to restrict it right here because I don't do that during development, and I'm not going to be sharing this API key with anyone. And by the time you see this video, it will be deleted. So it doesn't matter in my case. But once you've deployed it and that API key can become public to people, then you can lock it down right here to your domain only.